Welcome to Mr. Kellen's Stories, where every story takes you on a journey filled with thrill, emotions, and life-changing lessons. Here we bring you suspenseful twists that keep you hooked, heartwarming moments that touch your soul, powerful messages that inspire you. Don't just watch, experience the stories. This heartwarming, suspenseful story will keep you hooked till the very end. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more thrilling and emotional stories. Now let's dive into today's story. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound blending into the soft hum of conversation, the occasional clatter of dishes, and the comforting sizzle from the kitchen. It was just another night at Rosie's Diner, a small but beloved spot in the heart of town, where the scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm apple pie wrapped around customers like an old, familiar embrace. Emily Carter wiped down the counter with practiced ease, her fingers moving automatically over the smooth surface. She had worked here for nearly a decade, serving coffee, offering kind smiles, and sometimes even lending an ear to those who needed it. The diner wasn't just a place to eat. It was a place where stories unfolded, where strangers became friends, and where life's greatest moments happened over plates of steaming pancakes and cups of black coffee. She knew almost everyone who walked through those glass doors. There was old Mr. Thompson, who always grumbled about the weather but never left without tipping generously. There was Linda, a single mother who brought her little boy in every Saturday for a treat. Then there was Sam, the truck driver who spent more time in the diner than on the road, sharing tales of highways and lonely nights. Tonight, however, the air felt different. Something stirred deep in Emily's chest, an uneasiness she couldn't quite place. The wind outside howled against the windows, rattling them slightly, and the neon sign flickered as if struggling to stay alive against the cold. She tightened her apron, shaking off the feeling. It was just another night, she told herself. And then the door swung open. A gust of cold air rushed in, sending a shiver down Emily's spine. She turned to see a group of men entering, their presence commanding attention. The one in front stood out immediately. Tall, impeccably dressed, and exuding quiet confidence, he didn't need to announce who he was. Everyone in town already knew him. Daniel Hayes, the young millionaire who had taken the business world by storm. Emily had served him before, though she doubted he remembered. He wasn't like the other rich men who passed through town, treating waitresses as if they were invisible. No, Daniel was different. Despite his wealth and success, he had a kindness about him, a humility that was rare among people of his status. He never flaunted his money, never demanded special treatment. In fact, he seemed to prefer the simple pleasures of the diner, opting for a classic cheeseburger over fancy five-star meals. She had always respected him for that, but tonight, something was off. Daniel walked in with his usual air of calm, but it was the man walking beside him that made Emily's stomach tighten. She recognized him instantly, the sharp suit, the slicked-back hair, the too-perfect smile. Victor. Her grip tightened on the coffee pot she had been holding. She had seen this man before. He wasn't from town, but he had passed through enough times, always in the company of wealthy men. And every time, trouble followed. She didn't know the details, but she had overheard whispers, stories of business deals gone wrong, of people losing everything after trusting him. Emily had a good sense for people. It came with the job. You learned to read faces, to sense lies woven between words, to pick up on the subtle shifts in a person's demeanor. And everything about Victor screamed danger. She forced herself to remain calm, plastering on her usual friendly smile as the group took their seats in the corner booth. She walked over, pen and notepad in hand. "Good evening, gentlemen. What can I get you?" Daniel smiled politely, but Victor barely glanced at her, too engrossed in whatever he was saying. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that could make you believe anything if you weren't careful. Emily pretended not to listen, but she couldn't help catching snippets of their conversation. Guaranteed returns, Daniel. I'm telling you, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Trust me, everyone who's invested has made a fortune. Emily's heart pounded. She had heard this pitch before, not these exact words, but the rhythm, the promises, the way Victor leaned in, his voice just low enough to create an air of secrecy. It was the same con she had seen ruin people's lives. Daniel nodded, seemingly interested, but something in his eyes told Emily he was unsure. That gave her hope. Maybe he wasn't fully convinced. She needed to warn him. But how? She was just a waitress, a nobody in the grand scheme of things. If she spoke up, would Daniel even listen? Or worse, would she anger Victor, who clearly had no problem manipulating powerful people? Her palms felt clammy as she refilled their water glasses. Daniel thanked her, as he always did, but Victor didn't even acknowledge her presence. Emily knew she had a choice. She could say nothing, continue with her shift, and pretend she didn't see the danger. Or she could take a risk, one that might cost her job, but could save Daniel from a terrible mistake. Her heart raced as she made her decision. She would warn him. Because sometimes the truth had to be spoken, no matter the cost. Emily had always been a good observer. It came with the job. Years of working at the diner had trained her to read people like an open book. She could tell when a couple was on their first date by the nervous glances and hesitant smiles. She could sense when someone was having a bad day just by the way they stirred their coffee. She even knew which regulars would tip well just by the way they folded their napkins after a meal. But tonight, the air around table 7 felt different. It was heavy, suspicious. Emily didn't trust Victor, not for a second. She had seen men like him before, smooth talkers, charming, always with an easy smile. But it was all a mask, a carefully crafted illusion. She had no doubt that Victor had spent years perfecting that act, using it to manipulate people into trusting him. And now he was working his tricks on Daniel. Emily watched as Victor leaned in ever so slightly, lowering his voice just enough that only Daniel could hear him. His tone was smooth, confident, like a salesman who had practiced his pitch 1,000 times before. "You won't regret this, Daniel," Victor said, his voice dripping with persuasion. "This is a golden opportunity, a once-in-a-lifetime deal. People would kill to be in your position." Emily frowned. She had heard that line before. Once in a lifetime. It was the phrase that scam artists used when they didn't want their victims to think too much, when they wanted them to act fast, to ignore their doubts. The more she listened, the more certain she became. This wasn't just a friendly business conversation. It was a trap, carefully set, waiting for Daniel to step into it. Her heart pounded as she poured coffee into a nearby customer's cup, her hands trembling slightly. She tried to ignore it, to focus on her job, but she couldn't. Not when she knew that Daniel was being played right in front of her. She stole a glance at Daniel. He was listening intently, his brow slightly furrowed. He wasn't completely convinced, that much was clear. But he also wasn't rejecting the offer, and that was what scared her the most. Victor was good, too good. Emily had no doubt that he had done his homework before approaching Daniel. He knew exactly what to say, how to say it, and when to say it. His entire persona was built around trust, something he didn't deserve. And Daniel, for all his intelligence, was just a man who had built his fortune with hard work, not by playing games. She felt sick. She knew how this would play out. First, Victor would make Daniel feel like he was part of something special. Then he'd reel him in, convincing him to invest just a little at first. But before long, Daniel would find himself in deeper than he ever intended. And by the time he realized the truth, that there was no business, no investment, no returns, it would be too late. Emily had seen it happen before, not to millionaires, but to regular people. A woman she once worked with had lost her entire savings to a sure thing investment, A young man who used to eat at the diner every week had ended up bankrupt after trusting the wrong people. She had watched people fall for lies like this before, and she had watched their lives crumble because of it. She clenched her fists. Daniel was a good man. He didn't deserve this. But what could she do? She was just a waitress, a nobody in this world of wealth and power. Who would believe her? If she spoke up, would Daniel even listen? Or would he laugh it off, brushing aside her words like they meant nothing? And what about Victor? He looked like the kind of man who didn't take kindly to people interfering in his plans. If she said something, he might make trouble for her, maybe even get her fired. Was it worth the risk? She didn't know. All she knew was that if she stayed silent, she would never forgive herself. As she walked past the table, she slowed her steps, pretending to wipe down a nearby booth. She listened. "The numbers speak for themselves, Daniel," Victor was saying. "We're talking millions in returns. No risk." Emily almost snorted. No risk. There was always risk, and anyone who claimed otherwise was lying. Daniel exhaled, drumming his fingers against the table. "It does sound promising," he admitted. Victor grinned. "Of course it does. I wouldn't bring it to you if it wasn't." Emily saw it then, Victor's eyes. They weren't the eyes of a friend. They weren't the eyes of a business partner looking out for Daniel's best interests. They were the eyes of a predator, cold, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Emily's stomach churned. She had to do something. She had to say something. But what if she was wrong? What if Victor really was offering a legitimate opportunity? What if Daniel already knew everything and was considering it carefully? The doubt crept in, wrapping around her thoughts like a vice. She took a deep breath. Number. She couldn't ignore what her instincts were telling her. Victor was dangerous, and Daniel was in trouble. The question was, how could she warn him without making things worse? Her mind raced as she placed the coffee pot back on the counter, her fingers gripping the handle tightly. One thing was certain. She couldn't walk away from this. She had to act before it was too late. The diner hummed with its usual late-night energy, clinking forks, quiet conversations, the occasional burst of laughter from a booth in the back. But at table 7, the air felt different. Thick, tense. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the coffee pot, her mind racing. She had been debating whether to say something for the past 10 minutes, but her gut told her she couldn't stay silent. She couldn't let Daniel walk into this trap. As she approached the table, her heart pounded so loudly she was sure they could hear it. Daniel barely noticed her at first. His focus was on Victor, who was still talking, still selling his once-in-a-lifetime deal with the practiced ease of a man who had done this many times before. Emily reached Daniel's side, forcing her face into a neutral expression. With a steady hand, she poured the steaming coffee into his cup, the rich aroma curling in the air. But as she set the pot down, she hesitated. Now or never. She took a breath, leaned in just slightly and whispered, her voice barely above a breath, "Mr. Hayes, I don't mean to overstep, but please be careful with Victor. He's not who he seems." Daniel's hand froze on the handle of his cup. He turned his head toward her, an eyebrow raising slightly. "What do you mean?" His voice was low, curious, but cautious. Emily swallowed hard, glancing briefly at Victor, who was too busy scrolling on his phone to notice their exchange, at least for now. She leaned in just a fraction more, keeping her voice quiet but firm. "I've seen him before," she murmured. "People say he's scammed investors before. He's charming, but he's dangerous." Daniel studied her, his sharp, intelligent eyes searching her face for any hint of dishonesty. She held his gaze, willing him to believe her. For a second, the weight of the moment pressed down on her. Who was she to interfere? She was just a waitress, a nobody. But she knew in her soul that she was right. And if Daniel walked into this blindly, she might be the only person who could stop it. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Emily saw a shift. Victor. He had stopped scrolling. His gaze flicked up, sharp and knowing. Emily's stomach clenched. Had he heard? Victor tilted his head slightly, that ever-present smirk dancing at the corner of his lips. His voice was smooth as silk, but there was an edge beneath it, like a blade hidden in velvet. "Something wrong, Daniel?" The tension at the table thickened, invisible but heavy. Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at Emily again, as if replaying her words in his mind, weighing them. She held her breath. Then, slowly, he turned back to Victor. He nodded. "No, nothing's wrong." But something in his eyes had changed. Victor noticed it too. His smirk never wavered, but there was something different in his expression now, a flicker of something dangerous. He knew that Emily had planted a seed of doubt in Daniel's mind, and Victor wasn't the type to let something like that slide. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. See, she had taken a risk, a big one, and now she had to wonder. Had she just made herself a target? The drive home that night was unusually quiet. Daniel Hayes sat behind the wheel of his sleek black Aston Martin, his grip tightening on the leather steering wheel as he replayed Emily's words in his mind. "Please be careful with Victor. He's not who he seems." Her voice echoed in his head, soft yet firm, carrying an urgency that unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Daniel had known Victor for years. They had met through business circles, shared expensive dinners, attended the same high-profile networking events. Victor had always been smooth, confident, charismatic in a way that made people gravitate toward him. But something about Emily's warning gnawed at him. He had learned early in life to trust his instincts. It was how he had built his empire, by reading people, by sensing when something wasn't quite right. And right now something wasn't right. Was he being paranoid? Victor had never given him a reason to doubt him before, but then again, hadn't he? Daniel frowned, thinking back on past deals. There were small things he had overlooked, minor inconsistencies in Victor's stories, deals that had mysteriously fallen through, business associates who had suddenly disappeared after working with him. At the time, Daniel had chalked it up to bad luck. Now he wasn't so sure. By the time he pulled into the long, winding driveway of his estate, his mind was made up. He needed to know the truth. He wasn't the type to make blind accusations, and he certainly wasn't going to ruin a friendship over a passing comment. But he also wasn't going to ignore a warning, especially not one that had come from someone with no reason to lie. Emily had nothing to gain from warning him, which meant she had told him the truth. The thought made his stomach churn. He stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at his skin as he made his way inside his mansion. The grand foyer was silent, save for the distant ticking of an antique clock. Normally, coming home to such a luxurious space would bring him comfort, but tonight it felt strangely empty. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had narrowly avoided walking into something disastrous, and he needed to find out exactly what. The next morning, Daniel wasted no time. He called Jonathan Reed, one of the best private investigators in the business. Reed was a former FBI agent, known for uncovering fraud and deception among high-profile individuals. If there was dirt on Victor, he would find it. The conversation was brief. "Jonathan, I need you to look into someone for me." "Name?" "Victor Lane. I need to know everything, his past, his business dealings, any legal troubles, and I need it fast." There was a short pause before Jonathan responded. "You got it. Give me 24 hours. Daniel hung up, his heart still uneasy. He had no idea what Jonathan would find, but deep down, he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answer. The next day, Daniel sat in his office, his fingers tapping restlessly on his mahogany desk as he waited for the call. When his phone finally rang, he answered on the first ring. "Tell me." Jonathan didn't waste time. "You were right to be suspicious," he said. "Victor Lane is bad news." Daniel's stomach twisted. "What did you find?" "A lot," Jonathan sighed. "And none of it's good." What followed was worse than Daniel could have imagined. Victor had been involved in multiple fraud cases, at least 5 major ones in the last 10 years. His method was always the same. He would gain the trust of wealthy investors, pitch them a foolproof deal, and once they put their money in, he would quietly drain the accounts. By the time his victims realized they had been scammed, Victor had already moved on, leaving them with nothing but lawsuits and financial ruin. Daniel felt his pulse quicken as Jonathan continued. "He's never been convicted," Jonathan added, "but that's because he's smart. He never leaves a trail that leads directly to him. The businesses he sets up are in other people's names, and by the time authorities start investigating, he's already shut them down and disappeared." Daniel clenched his jaw. "How much has he stolen?" Jonathan hesitated. "Hundreds of millions." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. Hundreds of millions. If Emily hadn't warned him, if he had blindly trusted Victor like so many others, he could have lost everything. His hands curled into fists. He had been one signature away from walking straight into a scam that could have cost him more than just money. It could have destroyed his entire reputation. He felt a wave of anger rise in his chest, not just at Victor, but at himself. How had he not seen it? How had he been so blind? He had spent years building his empire, carefully choosing his business partners, ensuring that he only surrounded himself with people he could trust. And yet, Victor had slipped through the cracks. If not for a waitress, a woman he barely knew, he would have walked straight into a trap. Emily. Her warning had saved him. He exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of his desk. He needed to act. But first, he needed to see Victor one last time, and this time, he would be the one in control. That evening, Daniel arranged to meet Victor at a high-end restaurant downtown. He kept his face neutral, his voice calm, but inside, his blood boiled. As he walked in, he saw Victor waiting at their usual table, his ever-present smirk in place. Daniel sat down. Victor leaned back in his chair. "So, have you thought about it?" he asked smoothly. "Are we in business?" Daniel smiled, but this time his smile was cold. "I did think about it," he said, "and I did my research." Victor's smirk faltered. For the first time, Daniel saw something flicker in his eyes, something almost like panic. Daniel leaned in slightly. "You've made a career out of scamming people like me, but this time you picked the wrong man." Victor opened his mouth, but Daniel cut him off. "I've already sent everything to the authorities," he said. "Every fraud case, every scam. You won't be walking away from this one." Victor's face paled. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one in control. Daniel stood, tossing a few $100 bills on the table. "Enjoy your meal," he said. "It might be your last one as a free man." Then, without another word, he walked out. As he stepped into the cool night air, he pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. When Emily picked up, he smiled. "Emily, I owe you a thank you," he said, "and something tells me a simple tip isn't enough." Her confused laugh echoed through the phone. Daniel grinned. Tomorrow she would wake up to find a brand new luxury car sitting outside her home. After all, she had saved him from losing millions. The least he could do was return the favor. The next morning, Daniel Hayes stood by his office window, staring at the sprawling city skyline. Sunlight spilled over the glass towers, painting the streets below in golden hues. But inside his office, the air was cold. His mind replayed the details of the report Jonathan had given him, the fraudulent deals, the bankrupt investors, the families left in financial ruin. Each line of evidence was a gut punch, a brutal confirmation of what he had feared. Victor had been lying to him for years. It wasn't just about money, it was about trust, and today that trust would be shattered. Daniel had called Victor that morning, keeping his voice calm, professional. He had told him they needed to meet. No details, no hints of what was coming. Victor, as confident as ever, had agreed without hesitation. Now, sitting at the head of the long conference table in his private office, Daniel waited. The moment the door swung open, Victor strolled in, dressed in his usual tailored suit, his signature smirk already in place. "Danny, my man," Victor said smoothly, spreading his arms as he walked in. "What's this all about? You sounded serious on the phone." Daniel didn't smile. Instead, he slowly reached for a thick black folder sitting in front of him. He tossed it onto the table. Victor's smirk twitched. "What's this?" he asked, hesitating before picking it up. Daniel leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "This," he said, his voice controlled but cold, "is proof that you were going to steal from me." The air in the room shifted. Victor's fingers froze on the folder's edge. A flicker of something flashed in his eyes. Surprise, then calculation. He let out a nervous chuckle, flipping the folder open. "Come on, Daniel," he said lightly. "Don't believe everything people say." But as his gaze landed on the first document, his face changed. His smirk vanished. Daniel watched him closely. Victor's fingers tightened on the papers as he flipped through them. Bank transactions, shell companies, fake investments, names of victims. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin. Daniel didn't say a word. He let the weight of the truth settle in. Victor swallowed hard. His confidence cracked just slightly. "I don't know what this is," Victor said, forcing a laugh. "Someone's obviously trying to set me up." Daniel's jaw clenched. "I had my investigator dig into you," he said. "These are the facts. You've been running scams for years, and you almost got me too." Victor licked his lips, his mind working furiously. He had talked his way out of trouble before. He could do it again. "Listen, Daniel," he said, leaning forward. "This is a mistake. I mean, come on. We've known each other for years. Would I really—" Daniel slammed his hand on the table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Victor flinched. "We're done, Victor." Daniel's voice was low, steady, final. Victor's face paled. "Wait. I already called security," Daniel cut him off. "They'll be here any second, and trust me, you don't want to make a scene." Almost on cue, the office door swung open again. 2 large security guards stepped in. Victor's jaw tensed. His eyes darted between them, then back to Daniel. "You're really doing this," Victor whispered, his voice almost pleading. Daniel met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "You did this to yourself," he said simply. For a long moment, Victor didn't move. Then, with a sharp exhale, he pushed the folder away and stood. The smirk was gone. The charm was gone. All that was left was a man who had finally been caught. He adjusted his tie, trying to regain his composure. "Your loss," he muttered as he walked past the guards. Daniel didn't reply. He simply watched as Victor was escorted out of his office, out of his life. As the doors shut behind them, Daniel exhaled, feeling an unexpected sense of relief. The betrayal hurt. But the lesson, that would stay with him forever. And tomorrow, he had one last thing to do, thank the woman who had saved him from making the biggest mistake of his life. The morning after cutting Victor out of his life, Daniel Hayes sat in his study, his fingers drumming against the polished mahogany desk. His mind wasn't on business deals or financial reports. It was on a waitress, Emily Carter, the woman who had risked everything, her job, her reputation, to warn him about Victor. She had no reason to help him, no stake in his business, no personal gain. And yet she had spoken up, because she had integrity, because she cared. Daniel had met countless people in his life, powerful executives, high-profile investors, billionaires who made the world move. Yet Very few of them had the kind of honesty Emily had shown him that night, and he wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. Daniel reached for his phone and dialed a number. "Jason," he said, when his assistant answered, "I need you to find out where Emily Carter, the waitress from Mel's Diner, lives." There was a pause. "Of course, sir. May I ask why?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. "Because I owe her a thank you. A proper one." Jason, used to Daniel's generous gestures, didn't ask further. "I'll have the details in an hour." And he did. By mid-afternoon, Daniel had everything he needed: Emily's address, a small, modest home on the outskirts of town, and a clear plan in his mind. A simple thank you wouldn't be enough. She had saved him from losing millions, from being deceived, from trusting the wrong person. He wanted to give her something meaningful, something life-changing. His eyes landed on the gleaming silver key sitting on his desk. It was perfect. The gift that speaks volumes. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily Carter stepped out of her small house, rubbing her tired eyes. It had been another long shift at the diner, her feet aching from hours of non-stop work. She sighed, adjusting her worn-out coat. Then she saw it. Parked in her driveway was a sleek, brand-new luxury car. Emily froze. Her heart hammered in her chest as she took hesitant steps forward. The car was stunning, deep midnight blue, its chrome accents gleaming under the porch light. And on the windshield sat a white envelope with her name on it. With shaky hands she picked it up and opened it. Inside was a note, written in neat, elegant handwriting. "Emily, you changed my life with just a few words. I hope this changes yours. Daniel Hayes." Tears welled in her eyes. She stared at the note, then at the car, then back at the note. Was this real? Her hands trembled as she clutched the letter to her chest. Nobody had ever done anything like this for her before. She wasn't used to grand gestures. She was used to struggling, to scraping by, to working tirelessly for a future she wasn't sure she'd ever reach. But here, in front of her, was proof that kindness didn't go unnoticed, that doing the right thing still mattered. Emily wiped her tears, a disbelieving laugh escaping her lips. She had warned Daniel without expecting anything in return, and yet here she was, with a gift she never could have dreamed of, a thank you that would change her life. And deep down she knew this was more than just a car. It was a sign that doing good, even in a world full of deception, was always worth it. The morning sun bathed the quiet street in soft golden light as Emily Carter stretched, stepping onto her small porch with a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The crisp morning air filled her lungs as she inhaled deeply, ready to start another long day at the diner. But the moment she glanced toward her driveway, the world around her seemed to stop. Her breath hitched, her hands trembled. The cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the wooden porch as she stared at the unbelievable sight before her. Right there, parked in front of her small, weathered house, was a brand-new luxury car, sleek, gleaming, and undeniably expensive. Emily's heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. This can't be real. Her legs felt weak as she stepped off the porch, slowly approaching the car. It was a deep, midnight blue, its polished surface reflecting the morning sky. The chrome accents gleamed, the tinted windows giving it a mysterious air. It was the kind of car she had only seen in magazines, the kind of car millionaires drove, not small-town waitresses who barely made ends meet. And yet, it was here, right in front of her house. For a long moment, she simply stood there, her mind racing with a million thoughts. Then her eyes caught something on the windshield, a white envelope. Her name was written in bold, elegant handwriting, Emily. With shaky hands, she picked it up, her fingers fumbling as she tore it open. Her eyes scanned the words inside, and the moment she read them, tears filled her eyes. "You saved me from a huge mistake. You didn't have to, but you did. You spoke up when most people wouldn't. That kind of honesty is rare, and I won't forget it. I want to return the kindness. This car is yours. Thank you for reminding me that true friendship isn't about money, it's about honesty." A soft sob escaped her lips as she clutched the letter to her chest. She didn't know what to feel. Shock, gratitude, disbelief. It all swirled inside her like a storm, overwhelming and powerful. Nobody had ever done something like this for her. For most of her life, she had worked tirelessly, scraping by to afford the bare essentials. She never complained, never asked for more than what she had. And now someone, a millionaire, had gone out of his way to give her something so extravagant, so life-changing, simply because she had done the right thing. She wiped at her tears, laughing softly through the emotion clogging her throat. This isn't real. This can't be real. Yet the car sat there, solid and undeniable. The letter in her hands was proof that it was real. And Daniel's words, they were what meant the most. True friendship isn't about money. It's about honesty. Emily had never expected anything in return for warning him. She had only wanted to protect a good man from a bad one. But this was more than just a gift. It was a reminder that kindness still mattered, that doing the right thing, even when no one was watching, was never wasted. She took a deep breath, her fingers brushing against the car's cool surface. Then she did something she had never done before. She allowed herself to dream, not of just getting by, but of something more. Maybe, just maybe. Her life was about to change forever. Small towns had a way of making news travel faster than wildfire, and Emily Carter's unexpected gift became the talk of the town within hours. By noon, it seemed like everyone had heard the story. A waitress at a local diner, someone who had spent years living paycheck to paycheck, had just received a luxury car from none other than Daniel Hayes, the town's most successful millionaire. It was unbelievable. Some called it a miracle, others called it suspicious, and some, well, they were just plain jealous. At the diner where Emily worked, the air buzzed with whispers and speculation. "Did you hear about Emily? She's driving around in a car worth more than this whole block. I bet she and Daniel were secretly dating. No way. She's just a waitress. Why would a millionaire listen to someone like her? She must have done something big to get that kind of reward." Emily, used to being invisible, now found herself the center of everyone's attention. Some customers treated her with admiration, saying she had done something brave, something rare. Others, however, looked at her with thinly veiled envy. As Emily poured coffee for one of her regulars, she heard the not-so-quiet muttering from a nearby table. "I don't get it," a woman whispered to her friend. "People like her don't just get handed expensive cars. What's the real story?" "Maybe she played her cards right," the friend replied with a smirk. "Rich men don't just give gifts for nothing." Emily felt a sting in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She had known this reaction would come. People always had opinions, especially when someone from the bottom was suddenly given something meant for the top. She could feel the weight of their doubt, their assumptions, their quiet resentment. But she also saw something else. In the eyes of some, there was hope. A single mom sitting at the counter with her young daughter gave Emily a soft smile, admiration in her gaze. A teenage girl who worked at the gas station down the street looked at Emily like she was something more than just a waitress now, like she was proof that good things could happen to regular people. And that mattered more than the whispers. A few days later, as Emily finished her shift, a local journalist showed up at the diner, notepad in hand. "Emily, everyone's talking about you," the reporter said, her voice eager with curiosity. "People want to know why a millionaire would listen to a waitress. Why would he trust you over his own friend? Emily paused, wiping her hands on her apron. For a moment, she considered all the things she could say. She could defend herself. She could argue against the rumors. She could tell them about how she had nothing to gain when she warned Daniel, but instead she just smiled softly and said, "Because truth doesn't care about wealth or status." The reporter blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Emily took a deep breath. "I wasn't rich when I told Daniel the truth," she said. "And Victor wasn't poor when he lied to him. Money has nothing to do with honesty." She looked out the diner window, where her shiny new car was parked by the curb. "People think this is about the car," she said, shaking her head. "But it's not. It's about trust. About knowing that sometimes the person with the least power is the one who sees the truth the clearest." The reporter scribbled furiously, nodding along, and as Emily walked away, heading toward the door, she realized something. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She had become a symbol, a reminder that honesty could come from anywhere, and that doing the right thing was never about where you stood in life. It was about who you chose to be. The air inside the diner was thick with chatter, the familiar hum of conversations mixing with the clinking of silverware against plates. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air as Emily moved from table to table, refilling cups and offering tired smiles. She had worked at Mel's diner for years, and yet the last few days had been anything but ordinary. Ever since Daniel Hayes, the town's youngest millionaire, had given her a luxury car, people had been talking, whispering, watching her. Some admired her, some envied her, some simply didn't understand. Emily had gotten used to the attention, but what she hadn't expected was to see Daniel Hayes himself walking through the diner's doors again. Alone. She almost dropped the coffee pot in surprise. Daniel wasn't surrounded by business partners or wealthy friends this time. There was no loud laughter, no polished suits, no talk of investments, just him, a man in a simple button-down shirt and jeans, looking oddly out of place, yet completely at ease. Emily arched an eyebrow as he slid into a booth. "What, no entourage today?" she teased, grabbing her notepad. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Not today. Thought I'd try flying solo for once." She smirked. "Daring move." He grinned up at her, but there was a sincerity in his gaze, something warm, something real. "May I join you for coffee?" he asked. Emily blinked. For a second, she wasn't sure she had heard him right. "You want to sit with me?" Daniel nodded. "If you don't mind." Emily hesitated. Not because she didn't want to sit with him, but because people were already staring. A millionaire sitting with a waitress? That wasn't something people saw every day. But then again, Emily had learned something important over the past few days. She didn't care what people thought. So she grabbed 2 mugs, poured fresh coffee, and slid into the seat across from him. As she placed the mug in front of him, she couldn't help but smirk. "You own a mansion, yet you still like diner coffee," Daniel chuckled, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Money can't buy everything," he said, taking a sip, "like good coffee and good people." Emily raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying my coffee is better than some fancy cafe in your mansion?" He leaned forward, grinning. "Absolutely." Emily laughed, shaking her head. "Well, that's a first." The conversation flowed effortlessly, like 2 old friends catching up. They talked about everything: Daniel's childhood, Emily's dreams, the small joys of life that had nothing to do with fortune or fame. For the first time in years, Daniel wasn't talking about business. He wasn't thinking about numbers or deals or the latest investment opportunity. He was just being himself. And it felt good. As the minutes turned into an hour, Emily found herself genuinely enjoying Daniel's company. Despite his wealth, despite his status, he was just a man, someone who laughed at bad jokes, who preferred simple meals over extravagant dishes, who saw people for who they were, not what they had. And for the first time in a long time, Emily didn't feel like just a waitress. She felt seen. "So," Daniel said, stirring a little sugar into his coffee. "How's the car treating you?" Emily smiled, shaking her head. "Still feels like a dream. I keep thinking I'll wake up and it'll be gone." "It won't be," he assured her. "It's yours, Emily. You deserve it." She hesitated before asking, "Why did you really do it?" Daniel met her gaze, his expression turning serious. "Because you reminded me of something important," he said. "That honesty matters. That people who have nothing to gain are often the ones who tell the truth." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "I didn't do it expecting anything," she admitted. "I know," Daniel said softly. "That's why it meant so much." Silence settled between them, not awkward, but comfortable. A mutual understanding, a friendship that had started with a warning and turned into something deeper, something real. Daniel glanced at his watch and sighed. "I should probably get going before people start thinking I'm applying for a job here." Emily snorted. "I don't know, Daniel. You might make a good waiter." He laughed, shaking his head. "I think I'd spill everything before I even reached the table." As he stood, he pulled out his wallet and left $100 bill on the table. Emily frowned. "Daniel, you don't have to—" He held up a hand. "Consider it my tip for the best coffee in town." She rolled her eyes but smiled. "You're impossible." He winked. "That's what they tell me." As he walked toward the door, Emily called after him, "You coming back tomorrow?" Daniel turned, a grin spreading across his face. "What? You getting used to me already?" She smirked. "Maybe." Daniel chuckled. "Then yeah, I'll be back." And with that, he walked out of the diner, leaving Emily smiling to herself. Because against all odds, against all expectations, a waitress and a millionaire had become friends. And it had nothing to do with money. It was built on something stronger, something real. Small towns remember. They remember the people who rise and the people who fall. They remember gossip, scandal, triumph and failure. And most of all, they remember change. For years, Emily Carter had been just a waitress in their eyes. She wasn't rich. She wasn't powerful. She wasn't important. She was just a girl who poured coffee and cleaned up after others. People in town never paid her much attention, except when they wanted their eggs cooked a certain way or their coffee refilled before they even had to ask. But now they saw her differently. It wasn't just the luxury car parked outside her small house that made people look twice. It was what that car represented. Emily Carter, a waitress, someone many had ignored, had proven herself in a way that had nothing to do with money. She had done something even a millionaire couldn't do. She had seen the truth when others were blind to it. And she had spoken up. Not for gain, not for attention, but because it was the right thing to do. And that changed everything. At Mel's Diner, the very place where people used to overlook her, Emily was now the center of hushed conversations. "You know, I never really noticed that girl before," a businessman muttered as he stirred his coffee. "I used to think she was just some small-town nobody," another admitted. "Guess I was wrong." A woman sitting at the counter glanced at Emily and sighed. "She had more sense than all of us put together. Imagine if she hadn't warned Daniel." The words spread like ripples in a pond. People who had once looked past her were now looking at her with respect. Not because she had a fancy car, not because she had a millionaire's attention, but because she had integrity. And in a world where so many were chasing wealth, she had reminded them of something more valuable. Of course, not everyone was happy. Jealousy was an ugly thing, and in small towns it had a way of whispering behind closed doors. "She just got lucky," some scoffed. "It's not like she worked for that car." "Daniel probably felt sorry for her," another sneered. "She's still just a waitress." But those words no longer hurt the way they once might have. Emily had nothing to prove to people like that. She had stood up for what was right. She had saved someone from being betrayed, and she had done it without expecting anything in return. Let them talk. She knew who she was. But while some clung to jealousy, others saw the lesson for what it was. For years, people in town had believed that money was power, that if you weren't rich, if you didn't have influence, then your voice didn't matter. But Emily Carter had changed that. She had shown them that sometimes the ones with the least power were the ones who saw the truth the clearest. That honesty mattered more than status, that courage was louder than wealth, that doing the right thing was never about what you had, but about who you were. And slowly, the town began to change. People who had once ignored her now greeted her with genuine warmth. "Morning, Emily," the grocery store owner said with a nod. A teacher at the local elementary school smiled at her. "My students heard about what you did. We used your story as a lesson about honesty." Even the mayor, a man who had probably never spoken to her before, stopped by the diner one afternoon and said, "You made this town proud, Miss Carter." Emily was humbled. She hadn't done anything expecting recognition. She had only done what she believed was right. And yet, somehow, that small act had changed everything. One evening, as Emily closed up the diner, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Need a ride home?" She turned to see Daniel Hayes leaning casually against the very luxury car he had gifted her. She smirked. "You offering me a ride in my own car?" He laughed. "I guess I am." She shook her head, but slid into the passenger seat anyway. As they drove through the quiet streets, Daniel glanced at her. "You know, I think you've done something bigger than you realize." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Oh, yeah? And what's that?" He smiled. "You changed the way people see things," he said. "You proved that the size of your bank account doesn't define the size of your character." Emily looked out the window, the town lights glowing softly in the night. "I didn't set out to prove anything," she admitted. "I just wanted to do what was right." Daniel nodded. "That's what makes it even more powerful." She let his words settle, a warmth spreading in her chest. Maybe she had changed things. Maybe for once people wouldn't judge others based on their job, their paycheck, or their social status. Maybe, just maybe, people would start seeing each other for who they truly were. And if that was the only thing she had accomplished, then that was more than enough. By the time Daniel pulled up to her house, Emily felt lighter. "See you at the diner tomorrow?" she asked. Daniel grinned. "Wouldn't miss it." She stepped out, pausing for a moment. Looking around at the town she had lived in for years, she realized something. It wasn't the same place it had been before. People had learned. People had changed. And maybe, just maybe, they would never look down on someone for simply being a waitress again. Because in the end, this wasn't a story about a millionaire or a luxury car. It was a story about honesty, about courage, about how the value of a person isn't measured by their wealth, but by the strength of their character. And in that small town, for the first time in a long time, people finally understood that. The small-town diner had always been filled with laughter, stories, and the aroma of fresh coffee. But tonight, something felt different. There was a buzz in the air, an excitement that made even the regular customers sit up straighter. Emily Carter stood behind the counter, wiping down a coffee mug, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Across the diner, Daniel Hayes sat at his usual booth, a warm smile on his face as he watched her. Tonight was special, because tonight he was going to do something that would change not just Emily's life, but the lives of many others as well. Daniel stood up, clearing his throat. The chatter in the diner quieted instantly. Emily turned, confused, as she saw all eyes on Daniel. "Everyone," he began, his voice carrying through the small space. "I'd like to take a moment to talk about someone very special." Emily frowned. What was he doing? Daniel looked directly at her. "Emily Carter," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "A woman who proved that character is more important than wealth, that honesty is more valuable than power, and that one act of courage can change everything." Emily felt her cheeks flush as the entire diner turned to look at her. She opened her mouth to protest, but Daniel continued. "Most of you know what happened recently," he said. "Emily didn't just save me from a terrible mistake, she reminded me of something I had forgotten. True worth isn't in money or status, it's in integrity, kindness, and courage." The diner was silent now, everyone hanging onto his every word. "That's why," Daniel said, "I've decided to start a scholarship fund in Emily's name." Gasps filled the room. Emily froze. "I want to help hardworking people just like Emily, who might not have had the same opportunities I did," Daniel explained. "People who dream big but struggle because of their financial situation." Emily's hands trembled. A scholarship? In her name? She couldn't breathe. The entire diner erupted in applause. People clapped, cheered, and some even wiped away tears. Emily, still stunned, felt her throat tighten as she stared at Daniel. "Why?" she whispered, barely able to speak. Daniel stepped closer, his expression serious but warm. "Because people like you deserve to be recognized," he said softly. "Because the world needs more Emilys. People who do the right thing, even when it's hard." Emily blinked back tears. She had never expected anything for simply speaking the truth. She had never dreamed that her small act of honesty would lead to this. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. She had spent her life serving others, never asking for anything in return, and yet here she was, being celebrated, being honored, being seen. For the first time in her life, she realized something powerful. She wasn't just a waitress, she was so much more. The scholarship fund wasn't just a gesture, it was a statement that character, not money, not race, not status, was what truly mattered. And that changed everything. People in town began to see each other differently. They no longer judged someone by their job or their background. They started listening. They started respecting each other, not for their wealth, but for their actions. And all of it had started with one waitress who had dared to speak the truth. Later that night, after the diner had closed and the excitement had settled, Emily and Daniel sat in her new car, watching the town lights flicker in the distance. She still felt overwhelmed. "You didn't have to do that," she finally said, her voice quiet. Daniel smiled. "I wanted to." She turned to look at him. "You really think this will make a difference?" He nodded. "It already has." She exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't know what to say." Daniel grinned. "Then don't say anything. Just keep being you." Emily let out a small laugh, wiping at the tear that escaped down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel chuckled. "No, Emily, thank you." And so the town changed, not because of a millionaire, not because of a fancy car, not because of wealth or power, but because of one waitress, a waitress who had dared to do the right thing, a waitress who had proven that truth matters no matter where it comes from, a waitress who had reminded an entire town that the real measure of a person isn't found in their bank account, but in their heart.